Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the PB&J podcast. We have a special episode this time. We have a special guest with us, a good friend of mine, good friend of Jordan's, and it is Pastor Jacob Gregory, who is joining us. He is a pastor in St. Louis, Michigan, of a Nazarene church there. I was actually briefly on staff there for a time, but there's a whole story behind that I won't get into, maybe some other time. If you want to check out what his church does, it's actually pretty incredible what they do. You can go online to 5812church.com. We'll link it down in the description. But in addition to that, he is also a co-host on a podcast called Gospel Jazz. We'll link to that in the description as well on YouTube. But before I sort of ask you, Jake, to let us in on a little bit of that, I probably should explain sort of how we know each other, because we all have a pretty strong connection. And Jake and I were in a ministry team at our college called the Preaching Ambassadors. We were two of the first two that were a part of it. So we had some pretty interesting journeys together, traveling around to different churches and meeting different people. But we were also roommates, not just once at college. We were roommates twice, because after we both graduated, I was trying to find a place where I could serve as a pastor. And he actually really stuck his neck out for me, hired me on as a volunteer, and I lived in his basement while that was going on, which I think that had a lot to do with how I was able to serve at another church shortly thereafter, because it's a weird thing in ministry where people like to hire pastors who are already serving somewhere. And because Jake was willing to do that for me, a few months later, I got called to interview at a church. And there's a whole story behind that. But all that to say, I have tremendous respect for our guest today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So going back around to your podcast, Gospel Jazz, tell us a little bit about what that is and what you guys talk about there.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I appreciate the chance. I like listening to you guys' podcast, and it's funny, the thought has occurred to me, dang, I wish I could be a part of that conversation more than once. And so when you messaged me, I was like, cool. So our podcast, Gospel Jazz,
That's awesome.
it kind of started really organically. So back last spring during the COVID shutdown, we decided, rather than pretending like things were normal or trying to do normal things in an abnormal time, we were just going to do something different. So myself and my co-pastor Nathan, and then the pastor of the Church of Christ down the road from us, which is also a church where Nathan leads worship on Sunday mornings before our services. We started getting together and recording a conversation just about ministry. We would come up with some kind of topic, and that was really the sermon for the Sunday. Rather than preaching to a camera, we recorded that and aired those on Sunday mornings as our services or part of our services. So we enjoyed that so much, we're like,
oh, interesting.
Let's keep doing this, and it kind of morphed into a podcast. So the name Gospel Jazz kind of comes from, and you might be familiar with this, Ben. When I was in grad school, in one of the classes, we talked about jazz music and how in jazz music, and I'm no musician, so I'm probably going to butcher this explanation, but jazz music doesn't really follow sheet music, right? There's no particular way to play the songs. There's a basic structure, and within that, you have the ability to change and move and go with the flow. And when you're watching jazz music, you might see one musician just goes off and does their own thing, and as long as it fits within these parameters, it's okay. And the other musicians kind of like encourage that and empower that. And so jazz is this kind of unique style of music where there's a lot of flexibility and rhythm that fits within the structure. And ministry is very much like that. I mean, there's some parameters, there's some basic framework, but it's kind of go with the flow and find the rhythm. And so we used that analogy as kind of our springboard to talk about ministry. So it's just kind of an improv conversation about ministry, theology, the church, leadership, and just kind of riffing off of each other. We have a plan and things like that, but just really kind of riffing off of each other, and we've had a great time doing it. We're not super organized yet. We're still working out all of the responsibilities and making sure things air in a timely fashion, but we're getting better. Um, so that's
Nice.
kind of gospel jazz in a nutshell.
Yeah, and you guys have covered some interesting topics, so I would encourage our listeners to go and check that out. Definitely seems very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jake, what's your favorite episode you guys have done? Favorite conversation?
Oh man. Well, back this summer we recorded one about racism in America and tried to tackle some of the Black Lives Matter stuff, and that was a hard conversation for us because we're three white guys from rural America and central Michigan, but we wanted to try and engage what was happening in our world. And so that one, I think, stretched all of us quite a bit. And we come from some varied political views. I mean, one is certainly more Jet is certainly more conservative than Nathan or I. We're more, moderates, but and for me, moderate having come out of a pretty conservative, worldview. So it's that creates some interesting dynamics. I think that was probably one of my favorite episodes we did.
Is that
Yeah,
the
that'd
Kingdom
be-
Politics episode?
No, it was back further.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
I'm creeping on the channel trying to find it because I'll send the link. Yeah.
I'd have to
Yeah.
look it up. But it's we did the Kingdom Politics was good. We had a local pastor, staff pastor, who also works at Central Michigan University on for one about politics, and we talked about some of the race stuff with him. He's a black guy, and had a really really cool conversation with him about all that stuff as well.
Definitely check it out, guys. I've listened to a couple episodes. They're really good. I'm kind of trying to ease us into some of these more like bigger questions. So, and if this is too big, just tell me to tone it down a little bit. But Jake, I know that your pod talks about this a little bit. What do you think the church's role is in America right now? Like, where do you see that being? And like, when you see that and evaluate that, where is the spot for us to be a source of good?
So, if I'm understanding what you're asking is what's the most important thing we can be doing in the church right now? Is that right?
I mean, to some extent, yes. Particularly for us in the USA, one thing Ben and I try to differentiate is that we don't have a fully global perspective. So yeah, but yes.
Sure. This is going to seem so simple and obvious, and yet it's not. Um, be a faithful witness of Christ. That's it. Just
I feel like
be the faithful people
really
of God. It is.
Yeah.
It sounds like oh that's it, but I mean it is. So if I can illustrate, I was talking with somebody today, and so we've done this church merger. The old Church of God building we're turning into a ministry center, and we have one nonprofit leasing space up there. That's a faith-based nonprofit. So I was talking with their executive director, and we had been having some ongoing conversations with Hope House, our shelter, some other nonprofit, and then a much larger, not faith-based nonprofit in our area that deals with. They're the community action agency, so they handle all of the funds for homelessness and rental assistance and utility dollars, all of that kind of stuff. And we just got a huge chunk of money allocated to our county and a neighboring county for COVID relief, like $5.4 million. But it has to be used by a certain period of time, and you have to build an infrastructure, a temporary infrastructure to do this. So there were some conversations about partnering with that agency was going to hold the dollars. They were going to partner with us to execute part of it, and we had some really good conversations. And then in a community meeting yesterday, the person from that really big nonprofit kind of said, "We've decided not to partner with any agencies. We're just going to handle it ourselves." And it was like, okay. And it was, kind of handled well, but I wasn't totally caught off guard by it. So anyway, that sparked a conversation with the director of this small faith-based nonprofit that we work with. And I said, I'm just glad, because she's like, how do we deal with that? Like, what do I said, honestly, I'm just glad to have a seat at the table. As a pastor, to have been
Mm.
invited into that space in the community. And so I look at it as I'm just there to be a faithful witness to Christ, or of Christ. Um, and we talked about some other stuff that we do. Like I said, I'm a part of our treatment courts, and I feel so privileged to have the opportunity to sit around the table with our district court judge, with our sheriff, with prosecutors, with probation officers, and some others, and to get to be a part of people's recovery and bringing justice to the criminal justice
Wow.
system. And I said, I'm really there to do one thing: to be a faithful witness of Christ, um, and just kind of being that consistent, faithful presence. And I think that's what the church needs to do more than anything else. The world doesn't need our programs. The world doesn't need our Bible studies. The world doesn't need um, more dynamic worship experiences. The world doesn't need more
Wow.
captivating speakers or more celebrity pastors that can just fail us and we have to grieve them. Um, Not that I just read a headline about Ravi Zacharias or anything before we started this.
No, let's not get into that. It makes me sad too.
It's awful. It's depressing. Um, but what the world needs from us more than anything is to be the faithful witness of Christ. That's not easy, and what that looks like is incredibly complex and looks differently in different contexts. But if we could just stop worrying about all of the other stuff that we do for our own preservation, and we're self-differentiated enough as a people to say this is what we need to do, um, I think we'd have a lot greater impact in the world.
Okay. Okay. So I know we're touching on some stuff we did in the pre-show. So let me just kind of open it up because Jake, I feel like you really touched on a bunch of good stuff there. I know you're studying things about a theology of place. I know that it's kind of like your main focus, and that's what you've been really wrestling with. It sounds like, from what I understand and what I've read up and trying to do my homework, that this is really kind of what you're advocating for, is like in that space, being a faithful witness in that actual location. You want to share a little bit about what you've been wrestling with and what's going on there? Do you feel okay doing that?
Yeah. Um, so the concept of theology of place is actually a new um, is a newer theological concept, and I'm in a program through Trevecca Nazarene University right now, and the class is a theology of place. And they even said, the professor's like, we had a hard time finding material on this. I still have to read like 6 books, so it wasn't that hard, but um, they had they had to really look for it,
Oh, love it.
because for so long in the church we have overemphasized the spiritual and de-emphasized the physical. Um,
Hmm.
we don't have a very robust understanding of the value of place. Our hope has been put in escape, not in resurrection and redemption, and so we don't have much to say about places being redeemed because, in our perspective, places are damned. Right? They're going to be destroyed.
Yeah, you just
Um,
get out. Get
right.
out while the getting's good.
But the truth is, all throughout Scripture, there is this consistent validation of place, right? Um, and in Scripture, the difference. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Scott Daniels' Embracing Exile book, but he talks about
No.
the creation narrative, and he talks about it, God separating, filling, and blessing. And he goes through that creation narrative and talks about how he separates the earth and the heavens, and then the land and the water and light and dark, right? And in the same order that he separates these things, he fills them. Um, in terms of place, it's the same kind of idea that space um, is the heavens and the earth are space, and then they're filled and they become place. Light and dark,
Mm.
night and day is space, and then it is filled and it's place. Uh, Land and sea is space, and it's filled and it's place. And that we were created to inhabit place, right? And that the result of sin in the garden narrative, the consequence for sin is being displaced. And so then what is the hope that Abraham and the people of Israel are given? That they will have a land, that they will have a place again. And then when they are unfaithful to Yahweh, what do they lose? They lose place. And while they're in exile, what does God tell them to do? He tells them to do embodied things that are part of their story: plant gardens, build homes, give and be given in marriage, right? Then when they come back, what does he tell them to do? Rebuild and restore, make the community livable again. Um, so there's this constant movement in Scripture from the people of God being displaced and God replacing them. And then in the New Testament, you see our hope. First of all, God becomes flesh and goes to real places at real times, right? It's not inconsequential that Jesus, God in the flesh, went to Capernaum, for example. Capernaum was a real city at a real time with real people, and God in the flesh went there. And there's something holy about that. There's something sanctifying of, of that place. And then ultimately in the New Testament, you see our hope is put in place, right? The kingdom of God is described as a very real, not ethereal, disembodied spiritual realm, but a place which where God will dwell with with man for all of eternity. What we've done, though, is we've peddled an anemic gospel that is less than that, that says physical place doesn't really matter. God's interested in saving your soul so you can go to heaven someday. Thank you, Church Growth Movement. Um, and so Theology of Place is kind of recapturing that.
Wow.
Very interesting. Do you think that theology of place, obviously it deals with how we use physical locations in space, and it kind of intersects with something that I had heard from a children's pastor. His name is David Snow. He's from Canada, I believe, and it was in a children's spirituality course. He came in as a guest and was talking to us. And he was asking us to reflect on like our most significant spiritual experiences as children, and then he asked us to he said, so I want you to think about where those took place. And it was interesting. He went around the room, and I think only one person mentioned like the sanctuary. Like someone else mentioned, oh, like it was, in my home, in my bedroom. Someone else mentioned it was, maybe outside or something like that. And his whole point he was drawing from was, uh, sometimes we like to think that there's only like very specific places that we can look at as, these are sacred places where something spiritual and transformative can take place. But really, that can be anywhere. And that's something that we shouldn't ignore. Now, of course, that was all in the context of children's spirituality and how to, you know, be respectful of space and how children interact with it. But I think that also plays into what you're talking about, which is, there is value to the physical world and how we interact with it. And I also maybe want to ask this question. I don't know if there's a good answer for it, but with understanding, especially in the time of like the exile and even afterwards, where the people of Israel were, trying to rebuild and, like what you said, make the place livable. I'm wondering how much a theology of place, how much would you say it intersects with like political conversation in terms of like making the place livable and how people are advocating for a lot of changes in that regard. Do you think it intersects there too?
Well, I think so. You know, the idea behind place is not just that we can God is confined to specific places, but that the place matters. That and that we don't need to be dismissive of. It's in part a rejection of Gnosticism and a rejection of the physical world
Yeah,
as
I was gonna
somehow
ask.
less than the spiritual. Um, so one of the exercises we've had to do in this class is to say, think of a place um, that you thought you were just passing through, but now you see how God was at work. So, like I wrote about when Darren, our middle child, was born, and how sick he was. You know, we spent 2 weeks in the hospital with him in that place, that hospital room, and what I saw God do in that hospital room, when all I wanted to do was get out of that place, but God had something He wanted to do there. And so,
Hmm.
what's significant about that place? So that's part of it. Um, but as far as your question on the politics, um, I think yes, it intersects. It's how it intersects, the distinction of how it intersects that's maybe the most important. Um,
Hmm.
you know, so our mission, you know, we're Restoration 58:12 Church. We get the 58:12 from Isaiah 58:12, which is when the prophet Isaiah is telling the people from God, um, you will be those you will be called restorer of ancient dwellings, uh, rebuilder of streets with dwellings. You will rebuild, and the message says, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again. Right? It's this idea that the world around us is broken, but as the people of God, we've been called to bring restoration to the brokenness around us. So certainly, um, we should be transcending politics. The question, I think, becomes your motivation in doing that, right? Are you in that work for the purpose of of changing broken systems? And I want to be careful how I say this to make sure I'm saying what I mean to say. There's a difference
Sure.
between going into that and you're fixing broken systems for the sake of fixing broken systems, right?
Hmm.
Versus being the people of God, uh, and you're fixing the broken system because it's part of your story. It's a part of who you are, right? It's it's who you are. So for me, right, I'm involved in treatment courts, but my focus in that is not trying to fix broken systems for the sake of fixing broken systems. It's because it's who I am. It's a part of my because we're a people of redemption and reconciliation, and that's a place where it's happening. So I wanted to get involved and be a part of that. The fixing of the system, the political
Hmm.
system, is a byproduct of that. It's not why I'm there. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm articulating that
Can
well, but
I bounce some ideas? Because I think I get you. No, you're good. One of the things, Jake, when you're talking that I was thinking about was that, and this is, I don't mean this to be critical. It's going to come out that way. I just am trying to analyze it. Like, I think part of the reason that our political left is the way it is. This is not a dig at my Democrat friends because I got many. Um, is because of a lack of like a material attention in general to like some of the needs of the world. So this is Ben's question, in my opinion. So what your church is doing is really interesting because you're right, it transcends politics because this is like a missional thing. But like, I guess my whole thing is like, do you think like because we've bought in as evangelicals and pushed so much to like this like what's the word I'm looking for, that Gnostic kind of view? Because we talked about this in our studying scripture pod, like that Gnostic perspective of like, hey, material bad, like Plato was right, let's get to this like world that's like ethereal and fancy and good and get back to the one. And I don't know, it sounds like something from Star Trek, but like my whole deal is this, like I think what's going on in our world, and I think where I get you're coming from, is that like the church needs to take its rightful place by balancing both, and it'll fix the systemic issues in politics in some sense because we'll be addressing the needs that have largely been neglected because our churches have been so focused on the material that we've even bought in. And this isn't a dig, but like even it's become normalized for us to affiliate with like a conservative political movement, and we've done that by like rejecting some of those material needs and neglecting those things. Does that make sense? Am I articulating what you're saying well? And it's not. I'm not saying that like one is right or the other, because it transcends that. I'm just saying like the part of the reason we're here is because of those things that have been neglected, if that makes sense.
No, I think you're 100% right. In fact, that's one of the things that I have kind of talked about, is I have become convinced. I don't know about you guys, but it's funny to me. I look back at all of our friends, my friends from Olivet, many of whom came from conservative Christian backgrounds, who are now very far leftist. A lot of them, Bernie Sanders supporters and stuff like that. And it used to really frustrate me because from an economic perspective and stuff, I have objections to it. But I've come to realize no wonder they put their faith in that, because the church hasn't offered to them anything but some disembodied salvation so they can go to heaven someday. The church has nothing to say about the real brokenness that happens in their community. And so if the church isn't going to do anything about it, maybe the government will fix it. So I think that's kind of part of what you're saying.
That's a really interesting reflection. Really interesting.
Yeah, go ahead, Beats. Sorry.
No, that was it. I was just affirming what he's saying.
Yeah. So I actually, Jake, I guess we'll get into it because I raised my hands and just kind of admitted all that. Go for it. Yeah, go for it, man. Sorry.
Well, I mean, and that, I mean, I just think, just as one example, right? You have a whole generation of people our age who grew up in the tail end era church where our focus was who could do the best programs, and maybe our whole lives were oriented and revolved around the church, but the church didn't have anything meaningful to say. I mean, by and large, right, the evangelical church, about anything besides itself and its own preservation and its own growth, most of which was people hopping from church to church. So we have never seen modeled for us. Who is it that said the church doesn't have, I think it's Stanley Hauerwas, I think, said, the church doesn't have a social strategy, the church is a social strategy. Right? Why? Wow. Because it's our story, it's who we are. So here's kind of my little, and there are some people who kick against this, but here's kind of my little historical timeline. And I've developed this, with the help of some others, this seminar called Poverty 101, and it teaches about rural poverty and homelessness in our community, that I get the privilege of going around and teaching, just teaching about poverty. So part of that, when I go to churches and do it, is talking about this. You had in 1964, you had Lyndon B. Johnson declares war on poverty. He goes to Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah.
He sits on stands on the front porch of a hovel in Eastern Kentucky, and he declares war on poverty. And there is this iconic picture in the newspapers everywhere the next day of Lyndon Johnson on this front porch. We're going to end poverty, right? At the same time, in the 1960s, you had all of the fear of the Cold War. We had been through World War II. The church was really struggling with its identity crisis. For the first time really in its history, there was a decline in church attendance. And we started to really get afraid. And into that vacuum comes two things. One is the rise in dispensational and escapism theology, which up until that point had been the margins of theology, which gives an answer to all of that bad stuff, the fear of the Cold War, our hope is escape. And the second was the church growth movement. And I think that in that moment, the church said, okay, the government's going to take care of poverty, we'll let them deal with it. And into that vacuum becomes those two things. And the church growth movement says what? Okay, so if we're not going to become a church, if we're not going to be a church that's for our community, let's just turn our attention in. Let's just turn our attention in. And it all became about growing the church, and the theology was rooted in an escape, which was merely salvation of souls. So in 2014, in the Church of the Nazarene, we declared Appalachia in eastern Kentucky a mission area, like a missional region, to actually begin sending missionaries to that area. In fact, Dwayne Mills was the first missionary to go there. And he tells this story
That's awesome.
of going there. And in 2014, you had Jay Height, J.K. Warwick, Dwayne Mills, some others on the same front porch that Lyndon Johnson stood in 1964, the 50th anniversary, same front porch. His son or grandson, I can't remember which, lived in that same house in worse poverty than those before him. And he looked at the Nazarene leaders and he says, in 1964, the government promised us an awful lot. Do you think the church could give it a try? And when I heard that story, that was like one of those moments for me when I was like, holy crap, we've missed it. So, I mean, talking about politics, we can't just go in fixing political issues or socioeconomic issues for the sake of fixing them, right? Fixing them is a byproduct of who we are. It's a part of our story. They're practices that we lean into, even if doing so kills us, even if practices, we're doing these things, even if doing them produces no seemingly results, we still can't pay our budgets, we can't afford a pastor, but we do those things because that's who we are. It's because that's our story. So I don't think so. Don't talk about politics. What good is there tearing down broken systems and rebuilding them with other broken systems? In 50 years, we're going to be the same place. We're just going to be broken differently. If instead,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
If instead the church goes into and says, "Wait a minute, we're going to be a faithful witness to Christ. We're going to do the things that we do because it's who we are," those systems will change. Now, there are some who say you have to be more intentional than that you have to be more practiced, more diligent than that. And I don't know, maybe they're right. But right now, maybe those folks are right. But I think right now, when the world really doesn't have much good to say about the church, they don't need our methods and our plans for strategically fixing those things. They need us to just be who we are. And maybe someday down the road, we'll have enough, change in our pocket, to use a Maxwell term, to do some of that stuff. But in the meantime, I think we just have to be who we are.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, bringing that idea, which is great. I think you articulated that really well. And I'm really, it's really got my mind going now. But I'm curious, and for those wondering, Pastor Jake and I both pastor in Michigan, which right now in February 2021 is still pretty well locked down with COVID restrictions and stuff like that, and the freezing cold weather. How does that play out in a culture that we're encountering, where people, spend much of their time by themselves? People aren't really doing anything in person. A lot of people, at least where we live, aren't comfortable meeting in person. Like my small group, like we aren't comfortable meeting in person. It's like I haven't seen any of them in person for almost a year. So how does that theology of place, and how does that, the church being the church and engaging the world, what does that look like in COVID? I don't know if you have an answer for that or a beginning thought, but I'd be interested to hear, because that's a question I think a lot of people are asking, even still after a year later. It's like, how do you be the church when you can't be with people and you have to do everything virtually? Like, is that even viable?
There's been a lot of irony in this. This program, this master's program, just started last week. It's incredibly ironic. And in fact, we were talking this week in our class, like, all of these books that we're reading need to be updated now for a post-COVID edition, because it's like everything we're reading almost doesn't make sense in our world. And I don't really have an answer except lament. Because I don't know I don't know how you do that, but I know that I think what has been most difficult for us as a church um, is that we can't be who we are. I think that
Hmm.
more than, for me anyway, more than anything else, the most difficult thing is I feel like I'm being forced to be somebody other than who we are. We can't gather around the table in fellowship. Uh, Even gathering in person is a controversial. You can't do it not controversially. At least here in Michigan, um, you we can't do our supper club meals, which is our meal ministry. Um, we've housed we have housed two guests in our shelter for the last 8 weeks. That's it. Um, and even when we were, I mean, that place is such a place of community, and this year it's sterile and it's awful. Um, we had such a great, and we still do. It just looks different. An incredible connection with the recovery ministry. We've got a group of guys that meet in our building, and I'm telling you, what they do in recovery is a whole lot more like church than what we do most of the time, I think. And those guys, they were coming, they were helping
Mm.
us work on our building for community service hours. And it was so awesome. We'd go to them and say, how do you guys think our foyer should look? What would feel good to you to walk into here? And they're like, oh, let's do this, let's do this. And they helped us redesign the church, and they had
Hmm.
investment in it. And now, I mean, it was so cool. J.P. Whitney, who was one of the founders of the Church of the Nazarene, there's this quote where he talks about in the Church of the Nazarene, we're a church where the most pious man and the drunkard, the purest woman and the prostitute, we all sit together on one table, right? And we were doing that. In fact, in my office, which
Hmm.
I'm not in my office at the church, I have, and I don't even remember how I got down this, but I got to finish this story. So, fall of 2019, we were getting ready to open the shelter for the second season. We were so far behind on construction, and one of these guys comes in to do community service. I'm going over the list, and he goes, "You're never going to get this done in 8 weeks." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I need your help." He rallies a crew of these guys, and they start spending hours there. These are guys who haven't had community. They don't have friends. Their whole social world has been stripped away from them because they can't associate with people who are using. They can't be around. They can't be in places that serve alcohol.
Hmm.
So they don't have. It's
Mm.
amazing when people with addictions get sober, how few friends that they have anymore. Um, they
Hmm.
started building
Sad,
relationships. We
actually.
stand out in the parking lot till midnight talking about faith and how my family's history with addiction and even some of my how I'm wired, how it relates with them. And I tell you what, man, we just about have revival out there in the parking lot. Um, my project during all of that was to refinish this 12-foot table that was given to the shelter, and it was a mess. And I refinished the top, and Allison painted the frame and the legs while they're doing all that work. And I said, "You guys will be the first ones to get to sit around this table." And so we got this table down in the shelter in the gathering place, and we had this meal for them. We made pot roast and mashed potatoes, and there was more food than you can imagine. And these guys, you know, they don't have much. A lot of them are in poverty or close to it, and we had this huge meal, and there was so much plenty. One of the guys said, "I haven't eaten this good since I've joined the court."
Hmm.
In that moment, we sat together as one people around this 12-foot table in the shelter in our church, and we had a meal that was so rich. It was amazing. And we took a picture of the group that night, and I put it on this canvas with that J.P. Whitney quote. That's the stuff we were doing. It was so amazing to see these men and women from our church who hadn't had much relationships with other than family people outside the church in decades, painting with criminals and building relationships with them. all of it came to a stop with COVID. And that's what's been so hard for us is we can't be who we are. So that doesn't really answer your question, I don't think, except to say,
No, it's honest though.
yeah,
You're just trying to figure out basically how can I be who we are, or how can we be
yeah,
who we are in a COVID world?
yeah. And I
Oh
know,
man, that's rough.
I know this. It's
Jake,
not
our story is
broadcasting
beautiful,
our
by the way.
services on Facebook Live to 8 people. It's not that.
Wow, that was a lot, Jake. That was really good. I
Really,
think
really good. Yeah.
yeah, I know. I'm just a little floored because it was so good. So Ben, we might have to cut this. I don't know, but like it was so. That was awesome. I'm really glad you shared
Yeah.
that.
No, I made a note to cut out because I know this is going to be an awkward silence as we just sort of absorb
Like
what was thrown at us.
wow.
Sorry.
No,
No, like
like
it's
that's what we.
really good. It was
Yeah,
really, really good.
Ben,
Yeah.
you gotta take it over. I need a minute. I just had revival in my basement from Mike.
Yeah. No,
Whoa,
but I think you make a
that's
really
a
good
big
point
bomb.
there, and it's something I hadn't considered, which is yeah.
I'm red. Look at me. I'm red.
Because there's so many people struggling, and I'm really glad you pointed that out. Just maybe it's just something that we need to lament. I mean, that's something I haven't really heard. I mean, every once in a while you hear someone sort of lament it, but the two major responses to having to shut down and socially distance, and I don't mean just like the 6 feet. I mean like socially distance, like not even meeting with other people.
Mhm.
The two responses have either been one of anger, of feeling like in some way your personal approach to life is just violated, or the other one is, I guess, an anger of another sort, just getting upset with people who are angry, and just being like, oh, you just need to suck it up, we'll get through this, whatever, just sort of almost like ignoring sort of the ramifications of this. But I actually really appreciate how you pointed that out, of being like, maybe this is just a season where we need to lament, and that's okay. Like maybe we don't have to have a plan on how to do this. Maybe we just need to, you know, take some time to breathe. And maybe a part of that is just, confessing to ourselves, you know what, this really sucks. And just letting that
Yeah.
be that. Because I think in some ways, like, that's healing. I mean, because people need to do that, and a lot of times, and this too, something that comes out a lot when doing
Yeah.
funerals as a pastor, and something that's really impactful is, in a weird way, I know I'm doing a weird tangent with funerals, but it's like you almost have to give people permission to grieve at funerals, because it is something that people just want to avoid doing. And I think a lot of the response with this last
Mhm.
year and having to wrestle with a lot of things is, maybe we just need to say to people as a part of our ministry, it's okay to grieve what we've lost this last year. Um, I don't know. I mean, what are
Yeah.
your, like, am I articulating that all right with how you approach that? Because I mean,
No,
that's kind
I
of what you
think you're
did.
right. That's exactly what we have to do. And I will tell you, one of God's greatest blessings to me this last year has been that COVID hit after we had merged, because I don't know
Hmm.
how I would have done it alone. And so I was fortunate in that. And any pastor out there who's had to navigate COVID by themselves, you are my hero. Um, I couldn't have done it. Because these are the conversations we've had, right? And I have somebody to sit down, we sit down in each other's office and go, gosh, this sucks. What are we going to do? I mean, how are we going to, and that has been therapeutic for us. Because I think you're right. You have to give yourself space to grieve and to let it be what it is. And that was one of the things we saw at the beginning. There were so many people who wanted to just push through and pretend like everything was normal. And it's like, this isn't normal, and this isn't okay,
Hmm.
and it's not going to be okay for a very long time. And the more we try to pretend like it's not I think the idea of funerals is actually a perfect analogy.
The deeper the
All
hurt
you're,
gets.
yeah, all you're doing is kind of separating, uh, is ignoring reality, right? And that doesn't actually do anything.
Yeah.
You have to give people the ability to name reality and give them permission to kind of live within it.
Hmm.
This last year, it,
Yeah.
it sucked. Um, you know, it's and that's been hard. And you have to get drawn us back into politics stuff. But man, that was been one of the hardest things. Is on top of everything else, it was so politically divisive that you
Hmm.
couldn't even
Yeah,
find. It
yeah.
was so hard to find common ground as a church to say this is what um, this is what we need to do.
Jake, you can opt out of this question, but I've always wanted to ask, as a lead pastor, like how did you do that? Because like honestly, like my church, like my wife's in healthcare. She works in like lung transplant. So like her group of patients is literally the person that's basically not older, that is like, hey, this, like, even the flu is almost a death sentence. So something like this with higher infection rates and like bigger deals is like, you know what I mean? You might as well just like walk in oncoming traffic, because that's going to be a lot less painful. It'll be a lot quicker.
Right.
That's really a gross analogy, but like we even send emails to our pastoral staff and we're like, hey, like, are you able to change these things? Because like we may not be able to go, because like if she catches it from somebody at church, it's not like, because we lived in like the reddest county in Colorado. Colorado is generally a blue state, but we lived in the only red county in Denver at the time. That's where our church is. And so like, and you're talking about political divisiveness. Like, I mean, it really boils down to like, please, hopefully I'm not being rude here, but like people who thought it wasn't a real thing, and then people who did. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Is that fair to say? Can I say that? But like, I want to know how you guys navigated that,
Varying
because like,
degrees.
say what?
To varying degrees, I think that's true. I think there was a
Yeah.
large number of people who knew it was something real. They just didn't think it was as serious as others did. Um,
Okay. But how'd you
but
navigate that? Because we sent emails and we had long conversations with our staff, and not everybody was happy all the time. Actually, most of the time, no one's ever happy. But I just want to hear how that worked. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to like understand it.
it was a lot of grace, honestly. I mean,
Hmm.
we have people, and this was interesting. It has revealed some of the divide that that existed within our church that we didn't know was there. I mean, as it turned out, our board was pretty well split with people you would consider conservatives who took a conservative take on the virus, and those who were more, not liberal but certainly moderate left leaning, and took a more liberal stance on it. And we just had to constantly have conversation, and it was really pretty easy from the time everybody was in agreement on closing, and of course we had stay-at-home orders, and none of us were interested in defying those. And then we started coming back early June, but we met outside all summer long, and with outdoor services, there's people who were like, there was a handful of folks who were like, we can't hear. It'd be easier to be in the building. Why are we doing this? But they weren't. It wasn't any significant issues, and at that point, they weren't board members. Um, it wasn't until we got to end
For
of
the
the
record, I
summer.
loved outdoor services. I want to do them again.
Well,
I loved them. Outdoor
ours
services were like the best this summer. I've had so much. I love it.
we had
Sorry.
ours were pretty miserable because it was either really
Oh.
cold or it was god awful hot and humid. And we used our pavilion, but it wasn't big enough to socially distance under, so people were out in the sun. They could, and then we're right on a very busy road, so
Hmm.
they couldn't hear. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. Um, and it wasn't until early fall when it started getting cold and we had to start making a move inside that there began to be some tension about, and the tension was over masks, and do you require or do you encourage? And
Hmm.
and the opinions fell along
Yeah.
the opinions fell along political lines, but the motivation was not the masks don't work or we shouldn't have be told we have to mask. It wasn't that. It was I can't
That's
bring
it.
myself to
Yeah.
turn somebody away because they won't wear a mask. And they were personal reasons, right?
Hmm.
One person said, "You don't understand. My niece is a rape victim, and her face was covered during her assault, and she can't wear the mask. And I can't imagine having to turn her or somebody like her away because they won't wear a mask, right? And there you go. Talk about embodied faith. It was a real person with a name and a story that was informing her perspective. And so what ended up happening in our church is we had conversations um, where people left without actually their hearts being clear, and then they would come to us afterwards and would say, "This is what we were really thinking." Now that I've had more time to think about it, which really just means I was too scared to say it at the time. Um, here's what I really feel like. Okay,
Yeah.
so then we start to recalibrate, and then we come to another meeting, and it's like, oh, then the other side is going, wait a minute, now it's all changed, but they don't want to say anything. So then they come to us privately, and we're like, well, how did this change? And so finally we got to where we said, wait a minute, okay, no more of this. This is the space to talk about it and share what you want to share. And through that, we kind of found the language that everybody was comfortable with. And then we didn't have any issues after that. But
That's awesome.
that was kind of our way of saying, wait a sec, we have to do this together, which means everybody's opinion matters. And and you have to share that. You can't walk away and be mad nobody took you seriously when you didn't share your opinion. Um, and then
Wow.
when
Well
we
said.
closed down it, that was in like September. We shut down again before Thanksgiving. We were only open about 6 weeks. And even now, our
Hmm.
services are, I think kind of the language we use is it's an online emphasis. The building's open if you want to come in and participate in person, you can. And we have had at most like 4 people come. So because we were pre-recording and premiering because it was easier to do because our technology kind of sucks. Um, so we transitioned to live streaming and letting those who wanted to come in, you know, kind of be in studio, so to speak. And we've had very few people come and do it because it's a largely older congregation, and they don't they either shouldn't be out or they're afraid to be
Okay.
out, um, and shouldn't be out. So
Hmm.
Appreciate that they're being safe though. My
yeah,
church had, and the reason I asked, I wasn't trying to set you off. I don't have a strong opinion. I'm just curious how you navigated it. My church had some like real hard like masks aren't real. This is all just fake. Like this is an invention by the political left to do all that. Like I mean my part of, and this isn't bad, but like the play, our church is located in a place where, or yeah, our church is located in a place. It's like it's very common to like, it's the kind of people that drive around with like giant trucks and Trump flags, like intentionally, like the people that block traffic and like they ran people off the road. That like we had a rally go through our main area. And it's just like for me, I was actually really annoyed because I was trying to go to the grocery store and it took me like literally like an hour to get half a mile down the road to pick up groceries. I just wish I'd have walked. Um, but my milk would have went bad. So anyway, neither here nor there. But like just stuff like that. So I was just curious how you handled it. I'm glad that you guys haven't had quite that level of extremity. But like I just was curious. But like I like what you said though, because I thought it was really cool. Like you said, everybody's opinion matters and we have to move forward together. So like just say your piece. Otherwise you can't be mad that, somebody said that, you know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
yeah,
Anyway,
Yeah. And
sorry.
I
I
think that's
just
really commendable that you created a space where people could share, even if
and you
they, I mean, I
pushed them to
assume people
do it.
disagreed, but they could still share in their, yeah, and that their opinion mattered. And because I think that's so important. And I wonder if that's what a lot of churches struggle to try and figure out what to do as these more political conversations come up. I feel like I keep steering it towards politics. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to. It just seems relevant. That
I
this
blame you, Ben.
maybe, yeah. Anyways, my point is,
I intentionally wrote no political questions because I usually do that. And then
yeah, I'm sorry. So I took it. But
Ben's like, I'm cutting Jordan out of the podcast.
like, yeah, the church needs to have, XYZ conversation. We need to integrate more of, ABC into what we talk about. But I feel like so often, oh, how do I put this? I think people are nervous about having those conversations because they're fearful that one opinion will prevail over others, that they don't feel like, well, no one's going to listen to my opinion. And so I feel like it's really important, and again, I wonder if this is what churches are struggling with, is how do you develop those spaces where you make sure that everyone's opinion does matter, that everyone's perspective does come into play, and you're not there to try and only legitimize one person's perspective, but you're trying to have a meeting of minds and sort of find that common ground, and that way actually be the church. Because I wonder if that's, I think it's an important thing to do. I think that's what churches need to do. But certainly I can understand
Mhm.
some churches being timid about it because, you know, you don't want to create this whole mess. So I actually commend you for doing that, because I know that there are some pastors who are like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. This is what we're doing. We're not talking about it anymore.
Well, for one, that's just not our style of leadership. I mean, I'm a consensus builder, um, for better or for worse.
You're
And
good at that, by the way.
Yeah.
huh? I'm good at that.
As a person who's been led by you, you're good at that. Yeah, you're really good at that.
And I try to, cast a vision and help people get behind that. Um, you know, I'm not very top down. I've worked in top down environments and it's awful. Um, and
That's why you're good to work
that's
with.
not really that's not really my my side of leadership. Um, and I think it really comes back to, again, another Tony plug: speed of trust. Do people trust you?
Yeah.
And in the church, it's not just trust; it's do they know that you love them? And if they know you love them, then they'll give you a lot of leeway. Um, I think that's one of the most important things as a pastor is that your people, and I pastor a church where, and I had said that at one time, if you know nothing else, know that I love you. In fact, I had a whole sermon. Once I had an entire sermon, and it was about one of the I am statements from John, um, and Jesus talking about being the good shepherd, and I said, I, as your shepherd, you need to know I love you. If you hear nothing else this morning, that's what you need to hear. And afterwards, somebody told me, she said, I don't know that under our previous pastor anybody could have said that. And it took years
Mm.
to kind of build that trust and to make sure people knew that. And so I think, and that's not to my credit, that's, by the grace of God, we've navigated some of that stuff well. And we've been through some stuff together. Um, and so I think, when it comes to like this, um, they trusted us. They trusted me. Um, and I don't know that you really can. And I'm just so thankful. I I've been working with another pastor who came to his assignment 3 months before COVID hit, um, and
Oh my god.
yeah, and then the first year has not gone well. There's been a lot of division. A lot of people have left the church. A lot of people have, um, had left his leadership team. And I mean, certainly, because as a leader, right, you have a great deal of responsibility and all of that, how you handle situations and to control the things you can control. But my heart really goes out to him because he had no chance to build trust. He had no chance to let
Mm.
people know
Didn't even get him
that he actually cared
90
about them.
days.
And then he's forced to make all these hard decisions, um, and to be, devoid of community. It has not been an easy thing for them. So I'm just grateful that we've had, before COVID hit, we had 6 years of ministry here to fall back on and trust to fall back on.
Jake, can we talk about something that we kind of wrote in the pre-show questions, but also you kind of touched on today? Like, because I mean, really, I don't know, what I'm hearing you saying is like, by providing a model and space for grace, you allow people to be gracious to each other. So when we talk about divisive and hurtful things, we can just kind of like lean into that grace. So like, how do you think that we as Christians should understand God's grace, if we can, or to what extent we can? It's a big question, but I'm just trying to like get in there.
God's grace is a whole lot bigger than we often realize. That's what I would say.
Okay.
Um, God's grace, we want so badly as as a people to have some kind of to have something to our credit, right? To have some kind of responsibility or stake in our salvation or in our faith. And what we fail to realize is it's all grace, and God's grace is so much more pervasive than we realize, and is at work in ways that we don't realize at the moment. Um, and um, it's all grace. I mean, it's all grace.
The reason
So,
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
well, I'm just trying to think of a way to maybe illustrate that. So I love the language of prevenient grace, and I think prevenient grace is not just. I think prevenient grace is not only at work in our lives before we come to faith. It's also very much at work in our lives and keeping us in the faith. And I love that poem, "The Hound of Heaven," that talks about the spirit chasing after us. So, and I don't, maybe this comes to my mind just because I was writing about it recently for this class, and I'll try and keep this brief. But when Darren was born, he had some issues with with the structure of his urinary tract. That's kind of a fluke thing that happens in X percentage of boys. And his happened to be severe enough that it was causing kidney and bladder damage in utero. We didn't know about the bladder damage, but we knew about the kidneys. Um, and so when he was born, we knew he was going to have to see a specialist, um, but he wasn't putting on weight. He was very lethargic. We spent the first week, well, he came home when he was 4 days old. And then we spent the first week running around all over the state trying to figure out why he wasn't putting on weight. And they thought it was a tongue tie issue. He wasn't getting enough by, nursing. And even at that point, we were fortifying with formula. So when he was 10 days old, he spiked a fever. We ended up in the middle of the night getting sent down to Sparrow Hospital in Lansing. Um, they took him down by ambulance, and we spent the next 2 weeks there. And they began to prepare us for a 2 week stay that night, which to me sounded like a prison sentence. I couldn't imagine spending 2 weeks in that hospital room. I was going to go crazy. And we were there 2 weeks to the day. And he was septic. He was in kidney failure. And he was a very sick little boy. And we had these amazing nurses who walked with us during that. And it was over 4th of July weekend. And I mean, there was a couple of really profound moments in there. One where they talked about maybe moving him to ICU. The next day, they let us decide if we want him to stay where he was at or move him to ICU. And we both were like, we'll just stay here. And we said it was because, well, we trust the doctor and this and that. But the real reason was I couldn't bring myself to admit he needed to be in ICU. As long as we could just be in pediatrics, it wasn't that bad. And then they thought they had the infection under control. Turns out they didn't. They had to put him back on some medication, and his kidneys got to the point where his creatinine level, which should have been like 0.2, 0.3, they said if it gets over 3.0, we're going to ship you to either DeVos or Ann Arbor, your choice, because at that point he could need dialysis and we're not equipped to do that here. And if we wait till he needs dialysis, it'll be too late. So, and we said, I guess DeVos in Grand Rapids, and the doctor said, okay, I'm going to call the intensivist there and prep him for the transfer so he knows if it comes what to expect. Darren peaked at his creatinine peaked at 2.98 before it started to drop. We were just that far, and then the infection we found the infection was under control, and they were going to put him back on medicine that was hard on the kidneys. And he had in that moment, his kidneys had a 50-50 shot. Either they were going to heal or they were going to shut down. And the doctors had no idea which way it was going to go, which we didn't know until after the fact. And I look back on that season, and as scary as it was, and it was, I've never been so scared of anything in my life. Man, I can see God's grace at work in that. There was a moment I was home here, and I was putting Carter to bed, our oldest, and we were praying for Darren, and I thought of Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham had to sacrifice Isaac. And God kind of said to me, do you trust me with your children? And it was this moment where I was like, okay, like, I trust you. I can do this. And then after that, God was like, I was so angry. And the guy was like, look, you can be angry about this, or you can choose to see this as an opportunity to love and care for people you would never have otherwise met. And you can choose to kind of make this your mission. And so I think partly God knew that I needed something productive to do during that time. And so we just made it our mission to love on those doctors and those nurses and show them Jesus. And it was amazing. And so I say all of that to say this: it's all grace, right? Like even those moments that are so scary and I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, I can see how God's grace was at work, how he was saving me in that moment, how he was sanctifying me, and how he was using that for good. I mean, and I'm not saying, please don't understand, I'm not suggesting that God contrived and manipulated all of those circumstances, right, just to prove a point to me. That's not what I mean. I think Darren got
No, I know
sick
what you
because we
mean.
live in a broken world, and that's what happens in a broken world. But I can see God's grace so clearly at work in all of that. Anyway, that's again, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but that's
No,
what I had to
you
say about
did.
God's
Yeah,
grace.
you answered it always better than I want. Yeah, the reason I asked that, Jake, man, like not only did you bring it up in some of our other questions, but so lately I've been reading my small group's leading Mere Christianity with C.S. Lewis, by C.S. Lewis, not with C.S. Lewis. He's very much not here to read it with us. By C.S. Lewis, who's one of a big influence on me. There's a lot of long backstory to that, but one of the things that's a big point of this book is the cost of grace. And he just talks about like what it costs. And I don't know if did you listen to our podcast on the Capitol riots at all?
Yes.
Okay.
At
So
least the first one. And how many did you do? At least
just
one.
one, just
Okay.
one.
Yes.
Yeah, or insurrect. I think we call it right or insurrect. I don't even know what we call it, but either way, I was a wreck, and I asked Ben to do that because I need to basically have some therapy on the mic. Not a healthy place to be. So Jake, my small group's been reading C.S. Lewis, and we've been reading Mere Christianity, and one of the big points in the book is the cost of grace. Like he's really critical of the church, and I think in a healthy way. I really do. For it not living up to its standard of living, what he thinks it ought to be, or at least the way that we as Christians articulate to others, not only in-house, right, to other Christians, but also to those who are joining the church or even in the community around us, what the actual cost of being a follower of Christ is. You know what I mean? Like the danger and the
Yeah.
thrill and the nitty gritty. And like what you described to me was just like, I just thought it was really powerful because when I was reading the book, I kept coming to a quote you used to say all the time in college. And honestly, at the time, it drove me a little nuts because you just kept saying it. And like, I understand why though. Like I learned why later. You just said like, you just kept saying this and you're like, we can't cheapen grace. We can't cheapen grace. We can't cheapen grace. And I was like, yes, I know we can't cheapen grace, but can you please stop telling me that we shouldn't cheapen grace? But you kept saying that and it just meant so much. And I'm reading this book and I'm like, yeah. And what we've done is we've just like diluted to some extent, like what it costs to be a Christian. That like, I think that sounds dumb, but we've almost made it so easy that we don't look as different as we used to be. So when you articulate like your idea and your vision for like a theology of place, or even like what it costs to be me in the middle of a tragic moment, like a really, really, I can imagine what you're going through and also was going through with Darren. Like I don't want to ever imagine it, and I hope I never experience it. But like the fact that you're like God can break into that, like the fact that like that's to some extent like what the cost of grace is. To experience like grace in its entirety requires to some extent that like self, I don't know what it is, like that like die, I don't want to say dying to self, it just seems wrong, but that like what's the word I'm looking for, guys, help me out here, that conflict, that pain, that experience.
Self-sacrificial.
I guess I just don't want to say that for some reason. I don't know why I don't want to say that, but do you know what I'm saying, Jake? Like, do you get what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I just really appreciate what you had to say. And I just kept thinking about like all the conversations we had upstairs in college. Cause like, it just brought me back to that place, and like, just to watch that thought grow and how it's shifted in your life. It's been something that's been challenging me personally. And it's been something I've been thinking a lot about, and even my own church groups have been thinking a lot about. So I'm just really glad you answered that question. Cause, for me a little bit, that's kind of like next steps of what I'm looking for.
I have forgotten about those about that statement and that conversation, but I think that when Paul talks about where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. But shall we go on sinning? By no means, right? And oftentimes, we don't realize we're doing it, but in the church, we want so badly to live like everybody else that we fail to see um, that grace that God has at work in our lives, and we I don't know that I'm saying it well, but you know
No,
God's
I like where you're going.
God's grace. Um, we were bought at a price, right? Isn't that what Paul says? You are not young, you've been bought at a price. Um, and so
Yeah.
I think that there is something to be said for that. That you can't don't don't degrade. God's grace is so pervasive and it's at work. Um, don't degrade that. Don't cheapen it. Don't make it less than what it is. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's not
Well,
to
well
be
no, my
honest,
tie-in was
as
that
much
like
as
you
I
just
used
talked
to
about how
say that. I guess I haven't thought about much lately.
no, but like my whole thing was like you talked about how much grace is like bigger, and like just like I don't know. I kept thinking to myself when you used to say that, and then as you were talking, just like what that requires of us, and like how in that moment, like you just felt like God was saying to you, like, hey, like in the middle of all this, like I mean, to some extent, you have a right to feel pain and anger and hurt, but like, no, this is your opportunity to do this. And like, I just,
Yeah,
like that's the cost. Like, you don't get to grieve the same way. You get to grieve, but you don't get to grieve the same way. You know what I mean? And when you said that, I actually,
right.
Jake, you just unintentionally pull out these nuggets of wisdom. Like, you're right. I think we do want to live a different way sometimes. Like, I think there's the huge temptation among Christians, including myself, is like, I mean, I just so want to be like the world and have that, have my cake and eat it too, but I can't. You just can't, you know? I don't know. I just thought it was so good, dude. I
Yeah,
just really wanted to like, I don't know. I saw the tie. I went for the tie-in, that is.
but kind of to that point too. I remember a conversation with my dad and him saying, if your approach to sin is how close can I get to that line without crossing it, um, you, your approach is wrong, basically, right? That's part of
That's a good
cheapening that
dadism. I
grace,
like.
right? you know, um,
No, it's awesome. It's true.
our our approach should not be how much can we get away with and still be Christian, right? It's God's grace is too much is bigger than that.
Yeah.
But
Well, my
I
point
think
is just like the ways you don't see it, which is that
yeah,
previous grace points, like your prevenient grace point.
yes, and it is. I
Sorry,
mean,
no, I
like I
just
said, no, you're right. I mean, those moments like that. But just even preaching ambassadors, right? What a means of prevenient grace that has been in our lives. Right? Can you imagine college, our college without it? Right? Where would we? And we've already kind of talked about this. Where would we have been without Tony or without the preaching ambassador program? Right? Um,
I would
there
have
is so
graduated after
much,
my junior year. Yeah.
right? Um, there is so much in our and so you look at that and you go, man, that by God's grace, right? I mean, I remember, so here's how I got in the preaching ambassador program. Tony, early on in his days as church, you know, he'd only been back that school year, maybe the year before that, doing this church relations thing. Like it was, preaching ambassadors was early in his tenure as director of church relations.
Yes.
So he goes to my grandma's church during my fall of my freshman year and is talking with the pastor there, who I had known, Mark Walker. And Mark tells him, that we got this kid, that you really should get to know him. He'd be great. Um, and so, uh, you know, he he tells Tony about me, and then I get this random email from Tony, and I don't know who he is, right? And look at how much of my life changed as a result of that one conversation.
An email,
Right, in an email. I got some email, Tony Fightmaster. I thought, what is this? Spam? Whose name is Fightmaster?
Yeah, I know.
Right?
I thought that. I didn't want to say it though.
And so that's grace, right? That's God's grace at work in our lives.
Just directing those paths, preparing those places and tables.
Yeah. Again, think about theology of place. Reading the New Testament by God's grace, right? By God's grace, Zacchaeus didn't wait till the next time Jesus was going to pass through Jericho to go see him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you're not wrong. It's powerful. It's true.
Just anyway, thinking about place, right, and the concreteness of Jesus' ministry. You have real people who are just crossing paths with him, whose lives change. By God's grace, they happen to be there the day Jesus is going right to town. What if the woman at the well came to the well half an hour earlier that day?
Yeah.
By God's grace, she was
No,
there.
it's powerful.
Yeah.
So
And
anyway.
I think this is something else too to be encouraged by, especially nowadays, is recognizing, maybe sort of tying all this together, all the frustrations that we were experiencing with COVID, and all of the seemingly closed doors that we've experienced, and all the tensions and stuff like that. And I'm not trying to get back into that whole conversation, but also recognizing, how God worked in the past, and also, he's still working now. We don't have to even see it for it to be taking place, and to know that it's taking place. And I think that could be encouraging too, because the ministry I started with young adults, like we started that in January, and then 3 months later everything shuts down. Like it's been a rough year, and I have an upcoming meeting where I'm going to be projecting about, what does the next year look like? And honestly, I have no idea, because no one knows. But there is, I think, a lot to be said for just recognizing, we don't have to have all the answers, because we can know, and we can rest in the fact that someday in the future we're going to look back and be like, man, God was at work there. And look at all the things that happened that we just had no idea that what was really going on, and how much of an impact that they had on the future. And like even me listening to your guys' stories about how the preaching ambassadors, how it impacted your lives. Like I didn't know that stuff until I like heard you talk about it. Like I knew a little bit of it, but I'm sitting here and I'm just like, man, like who would have thought, like when when we sat down, and when this program started, like we didn't plan any of that out. Like that wasn't a part of the vision. It just sort of happened. But in just seeing how, just stepping out in obedience. And sometimes you don't even know you're being obedient. Sometimes you're just living, and it's God working in those ways. It is, so it's pretty incredible.
That's
So
not
yeah,
what
I
we
think
spent
there's
some
something
time talking
encouraging
about.
there. Say what?
Can I say a bit about COVID. Can I say a quick bit about COVID real fast?
Go right ahead.
Sure.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's about grace though.
Give me your permission as if it's my podcast.
I was asking Ben. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Jake, your opinion doesn't matter. You're a guest. I'm just kidding. But thanks for giving it to me, though. I appreciate it. Regardless, my life, Ben, when you were talking, and actually as you were talking, like, I don't know what it's like to be a pastor, lead a church during COVID. And that was probably really difficult. It probably feels like a momentum killer in some sense. But as a layperson, like this, COVID's been tough. Like it's been mentally draining. Like I have some mild anxiety. Like I don't have actual disorder, but I'm prone to it. Like I have TMJ, if you know what that is. It's tension in your jaw, so I can get locked jaw and stuff like that. But it's been flaring up really bad during COVID. But one of the things that's been really good is like, and this sounds really corny, but like I started this podcast. Like I used to talk with Ben a little bit, but like I've connected with Ben. Like I talk to Ben probably as much as I talk to any of my really like close friends. Like it's been such a good thing. Like I forgot, and I told Ben this like a couple weeks ago. I forgot how much fun we had at dinner. Like right now, like Jake, when I wouldn't, I don't have a problem with you. I love talking to you, but like I wouldn't have thought to reach out to you if I didn't want to have you on this pod. You know what I mean? And I've had this great conversation. You just like challenging me and like unintentionally pouring powerful truths into my life and having me reflect, on my own spiritual, well, not even, I don't even call it a spiritual journey, on my own life path and like how God has directed those steps. And even then, like in COVID, like I read 20 books last year and most of them like really challenged and reinvigorated some of my faith. It was things I've been putting off doing. And like, I've even taken the time because I'm at home more and I don't have to travel and commute to like make more time for my own spiritual disciplines. Like God's at work in the middle of a really crappy place. So like, I don't know, we talked a lot about the cruddy stuff, but I also want to say that like, even if we can't see it, there's little ways he's now like showing us now, but like, I don't know, like there's going to be some dividends that we'll see later. We just don't know what they are yet. But I really believe that, like, because I'm seeing some positive momentum already, like in my own life, and I'm seeing it in some of your guys' lives. Like Ben, like your ministry plans have changed a lot, but like think about like what this has been able to do for creating momentum for your ministry and a purpose and a direction and planning. And like I don't know, I feel like that's positive, and like Jake, I can't speak for your ministry because I don't know it near as well as Ben and I talk, but like, I'm just thinking about like that conversation with your board. Like think about how much trust and like, I guess we call it like capital, like trust and love and grace capital, the change in your pocket, so to speak. I hate that phrase, but you know what I mean? Like that you built up by making them have those tough conversations. Like, knocks on wood, right? What can be worse than this that they can't weather now? You know what I mean? As a board and as a church. But you know what I'm saying though? Like I don't know. Like I just that
21 is worse than 20. I'm blaming you.
I mean, so far 2021 has been 2020 with bangs. It's like really not all that different. It's rough, but I don't know. Who knows? My main point is simply this: you brought this like really powerful element of like just grace and truth and like that hope that Christians have, and I want to pull that into the beginning part of the conversation because I think we missed it, and I think you said something so powerful that like I wanted to call it out, if that made sense. I don't know, like I don't have a conversation I want to have. I just want to tell you guys like that's a thing that's happening, and if you're listening, be encouraged because. Not even a virus you can't see that's incredibly infectious, that could be really dangerous to you, you don't know, can stop the movement of God's Holy Spirit and what he wants to do. I really butchered that theological point. I'm sure there was like a really good sermon like ender I could have
No,
No, that was good. That was good.
no, that's great. I mean, no, that was really well. That is really well said, right? Not even this virus can stop the movement of God, right?
But yeah, I mean, like it's just true. It's not even like profound. It's just like, okay, yeah, it's a thing. But like it's there's a
How
parable by
infrequently do we think of that?
we don't. Actually,
Right?
can I share another little parable, a little didactic thing? A bit that's terrible. One of my favorite authors tells a story, and it's a speech, and people really hate the speech, but I think it's good. And he tells a story about like these two old fish or these two young fish that are like swimming by, hanging out together. And an old fish comes by and he goes, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they look at each other and they go, "What the heck is water?" And like the whole point of the story is not like, that like one knows something that they don't. It's not some kind of like Gnostic deal. It's that like the most like real, true realities are the things that we think about and don't notice. Like these fish have no idea that they're in water because their entire existence has been that way. And I think that sometimes naming and claiming, not claiming, I hate that, naming, stating, and being intentional about focusing on and talking about the simple and real and true things, and being okay with some of that sappy, annoying mindfulness sentiment is really, really important, especially for people of faith, to like not lose sight of kind of what's going on in the backdrop of our lives. Cause I think it's really easy, especially for lay people, to get busy. Why, I'm sure even for pastors, to get busy and into the busy and into the whatever and doing this and lose sight of the why, I guess, or like what's true. And does that make any sense? I don't know. Now I'm definitely losing myself, but that's, I don't know. When you said that, I just thought of that. What the heck is water? Well, what the heck is the Holy Spirit? It's like constantly moving. And I just like talk about it like it's an entity that's separate when it's not. It's present. Sorry, that was my.
I really appreciate you saying that. That was really, really well said.
Yeah, it was, and that's part of a conversation I had earlier today about the subversive nature of the kingdom, right? And then, and just how subversive really the work of God often is, right? God is at work in things and behind the scenes and but just below the surface so often that we don't even know it. And then all of a sudden, out from nowhere pops the kingdom. Um, so, we had, I told you I work in our treatment courts. A couple years ago, our court wrote a grant to participate in a training from SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health uh, Association or whatever for the federal government. 5 courts in the whole nation got to participate in this training. Our court was one of them, and of your court, only a handful of select team members got the chance to participate in the training. And for whatever reason, our program director thought I needed to be at that table. So, which I felt totally, inadequate to be there. But so we're at this table, and here I am with our judge and our sheriff and treatment providers and probation officers and the prosecutor and the defense attorney, right, or all and some others, and we're talking about need in our community and how we have inadvertently criminalized poverty, and what are we going to do to fix it, and how are we going to keep people because they're reoffending because nothing's happening with their need, and if we could fix the need, the food insecurity, the addiction, the mental health, whatever.
Yep.
Right. And I sat there with tears in my eyes. We were in the commissioner's boardroom of all places. We're sitting there, and I got teary-eyed as I'm watching all of these people have this conversation, and I thought, this is the subversive kingdom. The kingdom is breaking into this place, and they don't even know it.